By this time, the progress of the battle had proved him right. He returned to his unit with effective authority over the whole of the Anzac front. All day, Mustafa Kemal kept up the pressure, and the Dominion troops, who had managed to advance a short distance into the hinterland, began to fall back towards the sea. By now, Birdwood had discovered to his horror that he had landed his men on the wrong beach. He had expected to find a strip of coast at least a mile long. He found instead a cove little more than half that length, with only some 30 yards between the water and the cliff. Here, everything had to be brought: guns, ammunition, stores of all kinds, pack animals, and, all too soon, an endless stream of stretchers bearing the dead or wounded. That night he sent a message to the commander in chief seeking permission to abandon his whole position and to re embark his men. But Hamilton refused. Any such re embarkation, he pointed out, would take at least 2 days. Meanwhile, it had just been reported to him that an Australian submarine had passed through the Narrows and entered the Sea of Marmara, where it had already torpedoed a Turkish gunboat. There was nothing the poor general could do but tell his men to dig themselves in. Birdwood, busy with the Anzacs, would have been even more discouraged had he known how the European troops had fared. The French, to be sure, had done well. They had landed near the reputed tomb of Achilles, had seized and occupied the ruined fortress of Kumkale, and were now ready to join their British allies at Cape Helles. Here, however, the landings had been catastrophic. The Turks had held their fire until most of the transports had been drawn up to the beach and the men disembarked, and had then suddenly loosed a murderous hail of bullets. For the British troops there was no protection, and soon as Air Commodore Sampson reported after observing the scene from the air, the calm blue sea was absolutely red with blood for 50 yards from the shore, a horrible sight to see. In the shallows, all the little ripples were dyed scarlet. Within 3 hours, nearly 1,000 corpses were strewn across the beach. At the other four nearby landing places, the situation had been rather better. It was known, too, that the Turks had also suffered appalling casualties. Nevertheless, Hamilton's continued optimism remained astonishing. Thanks to God who calmed the seas, he wrote on April 26, and to the Royal Navy, who rowed our fellows ashore as coolly as if at a regatta. Thanks also to the dauntless spirit shown by all ranks of both services, we have landed 29,000 upon 6 beaches in the face of desperate resistance. But as other reports filtered back to London, there could be no doubt in anyone's mind that the cost of the Gallipoli operation, in human life alone, had already been far greater than foreseen, and that its long term prospects were in serious doubt. After 3 days, there was a lull, followed by what seemed a stalemate. The British and the Anzacs had somehow managed to advance a mile or two into the hills and to dig themselves in. Try as they might, the Turks could not dislodge them. For some time it looked as though the action in the trenches of the peninsula might become almost as static as in Flanders. Meanwhile, in London, all the stresses and strains within the government were mercilessly exposed. First, on 15 May, Admiral Fisher resigned, or more accurately, walked out. For some hours he was missing, and was finally run to earth at the Charing Cross Hotel. Next, Prime Minister Asquith was obliged to form a coalition government from which, in the most dramatic reverse of his political career to date, Winston Churchill was determinedly excluded. For the men on the beaches of Gallipoli and the others on the cliffs above, the summer was long indeed. As the weather grew steadily hotter, the flies became more and more insufferable. The food, the corpses in no man's land, the countless suppurating wounds, the proximity of the latrines, all these things attracted them in their millions and made life an even greater misery than it would otherwise have been. In the wake of the flies came the dysentery. By July, 1,000 totally incapacitated men were being shipped off every week to Lemnos or one of the other islands. But there was good news too. In June, it was agreed in London to send out 5 more divisions, giving Hamilton a total of some 120,000 men. De Robeck also, now that Fisher was safely out of the way, received substantial reinforcements to his fleet. In these dramatically changed conditions, a new landing was clearly indicated, and the choice fell on Suvla Bay, a few miles to the north of Anzac Cove. From here it was hoped to advance quickly the 4 miles to the Narrows, cutting off the bulk of the Turkish army on the tip of the peninsula. Suvla Bay seemed at first full of promise. Unlike the shallow crescents of most of the other bays, it formed a perfect horseshoe. Its waters thus provided an ideal anchorage for the fleet. It had no tall cliffs to dominate it, and was, perhaps for that reason, only lightly defended, as it turned out, by some 1,800 men distributed around the bay, without barbed wire or machine guns. It was, moreover, just around the headland from Anzac Cove. Once its possession was assured, it could accommodate many of the unhappy Dominion troops, and so relieve the nightmare overcrowding which they had endured for so long. The landings began under cover of darkness on 4 August and continued until the night of the 6th, the Turks apparently suspecting nothing. It was only after all were disembarked that things began to go seriously wrong. The newly arrived troops were inexperienced and undisciplined, their commanders old and for the most part incompetent, seemingly unable to cope with the hellish conditions prevailing. The chain of command soon broke down, Hamilton remaining hopelessly out of touch. Orders were countermanded at the last moment. Generals and brigadiers were encouraged to act at their own discretion. Seldom was it clearly explained to the soldiers what was required of them.